Good morning, everyone. My name is Mary Adden. I am an Assistant Director of Assessment Programs here at Campus Labs, and today I'm going to be talking about data collection and different types of assessment methods and best practices for developing those methods. So before I get started, the first thing I really want to talk about is just a focus on the assessment cycle. And if you've ever seen any of our webinars before, you've probably seen this graphic, but this is where we like to start because it's so important to have a good foundation for your assessment. So when you're starting to sit down and think, all right, I need to start assessing some of the things that I'm doing and the students that I'm working with, first thing you really need to do is start with your foundational documents. So think about the institutional mission, your departmental goals, any strategic plans that you may have, and you basically use those foundational documents to establish your criteria for success. Or in other words, you use these documents to develop outcomes for your students or whoever you're working with, or targets for your department. So you're really deciding, okay, this is what success looks like. This is how I know I've done what I want to do. Once you've established those criteria, you want to provide programs and services that facilitate those outcomes and targets. So you put on your shows, you put on your events, and then you want to determine how effective you were at meeting those outcomes. So that's essentially where assessment comes in terms of surveys or focus groups or what have you, but really you should be thinking about good assessment through all of these steps, how you're going to be establishing criteria, how you're going to be measuring that, how you're going to be able to measure the programs and services that you provide. So once you determine how effective or ineffective you've been, you want to use those results for improvement. And the nice thing about assessment is really you can use those results in every part of the cycle. So for instance, you can use the results to maybe reestablish what does success look like based on the results you've collected. Or maybe you're going to change some of the programs or services that you provide based on the feedback. Maybe you even need to rethink the assessment that you use. So maybe you used a survey last time, but really you need to use a different type of method to get at the real meat and potatoes of your data. In addition, you could even use your data to adjust or amend your foundational documents if you find that the data calls for it. So that's why we like to focus on the assessment cycle, and that's why assessment is so important, is because it really can impact all these different areas of what you do and how you measure. So we have this handy mnemonic for good, successful design, using the word design. So I'm going to kind of use this as a framework today to walk through how you develop good assessment and decide on the best type of method. So the D in design stands for determining your purpose. This is super, super important. I talked a little bit about it a second ago, but determining the purpose for your assessment, why you're assessing and what you want to get out of it, you really need to go back to those foundational documents. So your mission statements, your goal statements, and those outcomes that you want. So upon analyzing and considering, okay, what am I trying to get out of these different aspects of design, the mission, the goals, and the outcome, that's how you're going to be able to determine your purpose. So, and you might even find you have many purposes, but maybe you want to use one assessment for this particular purpose and another assessment for this particular purpose, or many different assessments to get at one purpose. But the real thing I want to emphasize is just make sure you're going back to those foundational documents to really determine and focus your efforts on what you're trying to gain out of this assessment. So some questions you can ask yourself. What do you want or need to show? So what are you hoping to get out of this assessment? What kind of data do you need to be analyzing or displaying? And we'll talk about the different types of considerations in just a few moments. Why do you need to show it? Is it in the strategic plan? Is there a focus? Is there maybe this is a hot button issue that you want to get in on? Is there a particular person who needs to be seeing this? So who needs to see the results? considering the format that you need to have those results in. Is this a boss? Is this a VP? Are these results for students? Are these results for outside constituents? These are all important questions to ask yourself. Who is the source of the data? Are you collecting this data from students? Does the source already exist on file? Do I really need to be collecting this data again if it exists somewhere else? And then how were you going to use the data? And this is a really, really important question, all about closing the loop. How are you going to make these changes? Making sure that you have a plan ahead of time before you even start sending out any assessments, that you have a plan for how you're going to use the data. Otherwise, you're just collecting data for data's sake. So take time to reflect on these types of questions. The E in design stands for examining past assessments. And I kind of touched on this a little bit before, but in all likelihood, you've done some past assessments. So whether they were successful or not actually doesn't really matter. You can even get good information from bad assessments. So when you're examining past assessments or just reflecting on them, the first question you want to ask yourself is, did you use this data? And if not, what kept you from examining it? So if you use the data, what was useful? What questions or what format got you the answers that you really needed? Was any of this data difficult to analyze? So did you ask a question in a certain way and the answers were just so spread across the board you didn't know what to do with it? Or did the type of question you asked not really answer the question or the purpose that you were interested in? So even if the data that you collected was difficult or didn't really answer the question, that's still useful information for you. That's basically telling you you've already tried that path, it didn't work, let's try something different. Were there any questions that you wish you had asked? Same idea. If you had sent a survey or you had a focus group and there was a key piece of information that you didn't get, maybe it's time to ask it in a different way. Same thing, any question wording that made the data seem too vague or you weren't able to interpret it. So basically, good past assessments should be repeated and bad past assessments should be avoided, and either way, you're still getting good knowledge and you're still learning from the experience. And this last point, what feedback did you receive from those who participated? It's so important that we're actually collecting that feedback and using that feedback from our students or whoever we're collecting the data from. For example, I know there was a case of a campus that I was working with who actually went through a couple iterations of their survey and they incorporated the feedback from their students who mentioned, you know, I don't feel like there was a space for me to talk about this particular topic, or I didn't understand this question. They made those changes and the data got better and better, and more people participated because they felt that the survey was useful now. So please consider the feedback from your participants. So the S in design stands for selecting the appropriate method, and this is a very big portion of our webinar, and so I want you to take close notes because there are a lot of different things to consider. So when you're selecting an appropriate method, there are basically 4 collection considerations I want to talk about before I get into the actual methods themselves. So first, I want to talk about the difference between quantitative data and qualitative data. So one of the things you need to consider is the type of data you're collecting. Is it quantitative or qualitative? Now, most likely you'll be collecting a little of both, but let me explain. With quantitative data, you're assigning a number value or a code to the responses. So you want to collect hard information on the who, what, where, and when. So how many times they visited the Career Center, which events did they attend, how satisfied are they with the service on the scale of 1 to 5, or how confident they feel in their ability to identify their leadership style from a scale like extremely confident to not at all confident. So quantitative data is great for generalizing your results to a larger population, assuming that you have a large enough sample size, which I'll talk about later, and it's easy to replicate. This data is statistically, can be measured statistically, so you can measure its mean, its median, the standard deviation, and so forth. Qualitative data is a little bit different, but it's just as important. It really answers the why and the how. It gets at the motivation behind the numbers. So questions where you ask students to explain their response or describe how a concept works or apply what they've learned, that's qualitative data. This data is narrative, and it's a little harder to objectively measure, but there are ways to measure it successfully, and it can give you great insight in what is working and what isn't.